There's something about fog that I've always found peaceful. Not the thick, choking kind you get in cities, but the natural fog that rolls through open fields early in the morning. It softens everything, makes the world feel quieter somehow. I'm not really an outdoorsy person by nature, but when the fog comes in heavy like that, I can't help but go out and walk through it. This happened on a Thursday morning in late October, about 2 years ago. I live in rural Tennessee, not quite the mountains, but close enough that you get that Appalachian atmosphere. Rolling hills, lots of open farmland, patches of forest scattered around. If I wanted to access a good hiking area, I'd only need to drive about 10 minutes from my house. I'd taken the day off work, just a mental health day. Nothing serious, I just needed a break. The night before, I'd checked the weather out of habit. It said clear skies, no precipitation. But when I woke up around 6 a.m., I looked out my window and the entire valley was blanketed in the thickest fog I'd ever seen. You couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. I made myself some coffee and just watched it for a while. It was mesmerizing, the way it moved and shifted. And then, without really planning it, I decided I wanted to go walk in it. Just experience it before it burned off with the sunrise. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my keys, and drove to this nature preserve I'd been to a few times before. It's not heavily trafficked, mostly locals who know about it. There's a small parking area and a few trails that wind through fields and wooded sections. When I pulled up, there were no other cars. I had the place completely to myself. I got out and stood there for a moment, just taking it in. The fog was even thicker than it had looked from my house. It was almost disorienting. I could barely see the trailhead marker that was maybe 15 feet away. But that was part of the appeal. It felt like stepping into another world. I started walking down the main trail, not really having a destination in mind. I just wanted to be in it, surrounded by that quiet, muffled atmosphere. Everything sounded different in the fog. My footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, and there was this constant, soft rustling that I couldn't quite place. Probably just the wind moving through the grass and trees, but it added to the otherworldly feeling. After about 20 minutes of walking, I stopped to catch my breath. I'd gone deeper into the preserve than I'd intended, following the trail as it curved through a section of dense trees. The fog was so thick here that I couldn't see the trail more than a few feet ahead of me. That's when I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle. It was melodic, like someone whistling a tune, but I couldn't quite make out what song it was. It seemed to come from somewhere off to my left, maybe 50 feet away. But with the fog, it was impossible to tell for sure. I froze and listened. The whistling continued for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded weird in the fog, flat and muted. No response. I stood there waiting, unsure of what to do. Part of me figured it was just another hiker, maybe someone who hadn't heard me. But another part of me felt uneasy. There was something off about the whistling. It was too perfect, too controlled. And the fact that it had stopped the moment I called out made it feel intentional. I decided to keep moving. I told myself I was being paranoid. People whistle when they hike all the time. It's not weird. But as I started walking again, I heard it again. This time, it was closer, and it was coming from directly ahead of me, right on the trail. I stopped again. "Hello?" I called out, louder this time. Still no response. Just that whistling, continuing its slow, deliberate melody. I squinted into the fog, trying to see if I could make out a shape, a figure, anything. But there was nothing, just gray mist. And then the whistling stopped. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. And then I heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, crunching on the gravel trail. They were coming toward me. My heart started pounding. I backed up a few steps, still trying to see who it was. "Who's there?" I called out, and I hated how shaky my voice sounded. The footsteps kept coming, steady and unhurried. And then, finally, I saw a shape emerge from the fog. It was a man, tall, wearing what looked like a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was obscured by the fog and the shadow of the hat, but I could tell he was looking directly at me. He stopped about 10 feet away and just stood there, not moving, not speaking, just standing. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. And then, slowly, he raised his hand and pointed at me. Not in a threatening way, not aggressively, just pointed like he was identifying me. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. There was something deeply wrong about this. The way he moved, the way he stood, the complete silence. I took another step back. "I'm just hiking," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want any trouble." He still didn't say anything. He just lowered his hand and started walking toward me again. Not fast, but deliberate. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I'd come, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. He was following me, not running, not rushing, just walking at that same steady pace. I started moving faster, my breath coming in short gasps. The fog made it impossible to see where I was going. I kept looking back, and every time I did, he was still there, maintaining the same distance, never speeding up or slowing down. It was like he knew I couldn't get away. I broke into a jog, then a full run. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away from him. But running in the fog was disorienting. I couldn't tell if I was still on the trail or if I'd veered off into the woods. Everything looked the same, just gray mist and shadowy shapes. I ran for what felt like forever, my lungs burning, my legs aching. And then, suddenly, I burst out of the fog. It was like crossing through a curtain. One second I was surrounded by gray, and the next I was standing in bright sunlight, the fog behind me like a solid wall. I spun around, gasping for breath, and looked back into the fog. I couldn't see anything. No movement, no shapes, no sign of the man. I stood there for several minutes, waiting to see if he'd emerge. But he didn't. When I finally felt steady enough to move, I looked around and realized I had no idea where I was. I wasn't on the trail anymore. I was standing in the middle of an open field, and I could see the edge of the preserve's parking lot maybe a quarter mile away. I started walking toward it, constantly glancing back at the fog line, but nothing followed me. When I got to my car, I sat inside for a long time, just trying to process what had happened. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That a man in a hat followed me through the fog? They'd think I was crazy. And maybe I was. Maybe the fog had just played tricks on my mind. But here's the thing. When I got home and looked at my jacket, I found something in the pocket that hadn't been there before. It was a small piece of paper, folded neatly. I don't remember feeling anyone put it there, but it must have happened at some point during the chase. When I unfolded it, all it said was, "I know where you walk." I never went back to that preserve. and I haven't gone out in heavy fog since. My name is Jordan, and I'm 24 years old. This happened about 8 months ago, during spring break of my senior year of college. I had driven home to spend the week with my family in Oregon, just outside of Portland. My parents had gone on a cruise, something they'd been planning for months, so it was just me in the house for a few days. I didn't mind. I liked having the place to myself. I could keep whatever hours I wanted, eat whatever I wanted, and just decompress after a stressful semester. The house is in a pretty rural area, not completely isolated, but our nearest neighbor is probably half a mile down the road. We're surrounded by farmland and forest, which makes it quiet but also a little eerie when you're there alone at night. On my third night there, I decided to drive into town to meet up with some old high school friends. We went to this bar, had a few drinks, caught up on life. It was a good time, nothing crazy. I left around 11 p.m. because I was tired and didn't want to drive home too late. The drive back is about 20 minutes, mostly along this 2-lane highway that cuts through farmland. There's almost no lighting, just darkness on both sides of the road. About halfway home, I noticed a car behind me. It wasn't tailgating or anything, just following at a normal distance. I didn't think much of it. But then I turned onto the smaller road that leads to my house, and the car turned too. That caught my attention. This road doesn't really go anywhere except to a handful of houses and then dead ends into forest. It's not a road you'd take unless you lived there or were visiting someone. I kept driving, watching the car in my rearview mirror. It maintained the same distance, never getting closer or falling back. When I turned into my driveway, I expected the car to keep going, but instead, it slowed down and stopped right at the end of my driveway. Its headlights pointed directly at my house. I sat in my car for a moment, unsure of what to do. Maybe it was someone who was lost and wanted to ask for directions. But why would they stop in such a weird spot? Why not pull into the driveway or at least roll down their window? After about 30 seconds, the car started backing up slowly, then turned around and drove back the way it had come. I watched until its taillights disappeared. Then I got out of my car and went inside. I locked the door behind me and tried to brush it off as nothing. I went to bed around midnight, but I had trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking about that car and how deliberate it had felt. The way it had followed me, turned onto my road, and stopped right at my driveway. It didn't sit right with me. Around 2 a.m., I was still awake, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like gravel crunching, like someone walking on the driveway. I sat up in bed and listened. The sound stopped, then started again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I got out of bed and went to the window. My bedroom is on the second floor and faces the front of the house, so I have a clear view of the driveway. I pulled back the curtain just enough to look out. There was someone standing in the driveway. A figure just standing there, facing the house. I couldn't make out any details because it was too dark, but I could see the outline of a person. They weren't moving, weren't doing anything, just standing. My heart started racing. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone. I thought about calling the police, but part of me worried I was overreacting. Maybe it was a neighbor who needed help or someone who was lost. But at 2 a.m., standing in my driveway without knocking, I looked out the window again. The figure was still there, but now they were closer to the house. They'd moved without me hearing anything. That's when I decided to call 911. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, trying to keep my voice steady. She told me to stay inside, lock all the doors and windows, and that officers were on the way. She stayed on the line with me, which helped calm me down a little. I looked out the window again. The figure was gone. I scanned the entire driveway and the yard, but I couldn't see anyone. I told the dispatcher, and she said the officers would still check the property when they arrived. They showed up about 15 minutes later. I watched from the window as 2 officers got out of their car and walked around the property with flashlights. They checked the driveway, the yard, the side of the house. After about 10 minutes, one of them knocked on the door. I went downstairs and let them in. They told me they hadn't found anyone on the property, but they had noticed something. There were footprints in the dirt near the side of the house leading up to one of the windows, my bedroom window. I felt sick. The officer asked if I'd seen anyone near that window, and I told him about the figure in the driveway. He nodded and said they'd file a report and that I should keep all the doors and windows locked and call them immediately if I saw anyone again. After they left, I went back upstairs and looked at the window they'd mentioned. The curtains were still closed, but I noticed something I hadn't before. There were smudges on the glass, like someone had pressed their face or hands against it. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for the sun to come up. The next morning, I called my parents and told them what had happened. They cut their cruise short and came home 2 days later. Nothing else happened while I was there. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I looked out a window, I expected to see that figure standing in the driveway again. And the smudges on the window, the thought that someone had been standing right outside my bedroom while I was inside, watching me through the glass, it still makes me feel sick. When I went back to school, I told myself I'd feel better once I was away from that house. But about a month later, I was walking back to my apartment after class, and I saw a car parked on the street. It was the same make and model as the car that had followed me that night. I couldn't tell if it was the exact same car, but seeing it made my stomach drop. I walked past it quickly, not looking directly at it. And when I got to my apartment, I locked the door and looked out the window. The car was still there. It sat there for about 20 minutes, then drove away. I don't know if it was the same car. I don't know if someone followed me from Oregon to my college town. But I can't stop thinking about it. And I can't stop wondering who was standing in my driveway that night and what they wanted.